Chapter 26, Hormones and the Endocrine System. In Chapter 26, we're going to learn what hormones are and what they do. Basically, two body systems are responsible for controlling the human body. The nervous system, which is much faster, but its responses are typically short-lived. The endocrine system responds more slowly, but its responses are longer lasting. The electrical system functions by means of electrical impulses, nerve impulses. The endocrine system produces chemicals called hormones. There are several different organs that make up the endocrine system, some of which do functions for more than one body system. Endocrine glands produce chemical compounds, hormones, in one part of the body, but have effects on other parts of the body. So we're going to look at the basics of hormonal regulation. We're going to take a deeper look in the human vertebrate endocrine system. And we're going to finish up with some more information on hormones and their roles in homeostasis. Homeostasis, if you recall, is that delicate internal balance. All right, the nature of chemical regulation. All right, the body needs to regulate itself, okay? So organ systems communicate either by way of the nervous system or by way of the endocrine system. In other words, all the body systems contribute to homeostasis one way or the other. So basically, chemicals produced by the endocrine system, electrical impulses generated by the nervous system. Keep everybody working together to maintain that homeostasis. By definition, the endocrine system is simply a group of interacting glands and tissues throughout the animal body that produce and secrete chemicals to initiate and maintain body functions and activities. That is the textbook definition, which certainly suffices here. So, the chemical regulators of the endocrine system are the hormones. Those are the chemicals. All right? Different structures, organs, and specialized tissues secrete these hormones, which are released into the bloodstream, so they have to travel to another part of the body. Now, hormones are specific for their targets. They're very specific for their target cells and the targets which they have an effect upon. So, basically, hormones produced in one part of the body travel by way of the circulatory system, but only affect cells, tissues that have receptors for that particular hormone. The nervous system also communicates and regulates, but it does it by way of electrical impulses. Now, the functional units of the nervous system are neurons. Neurons are the cells which generate and transmit these electrical impulses. We will talk about the nervous system in the next two chapters. So, a stimulus triggers a nerve impulse in a neuron. The electrical impulse travels, and typically the signal will travel either to another neuron or to a receptor cell. Neurons or nerve cells have to be connected to the cells or tissues that they have an effect upon. So the nervous system has a much faster response time, but the endocrine system has a much longer effect time. In other words, its responses last longer. All right, the process of hormone signaling is reception of the signal. That's when the hormone binds to a receptor of the target cell. Now, once the hormone binds, the signal is transduced, it's converted into another signal. And then once it's transducted, it causes a response at that cell. Hormones are one of two types. Water-soluble hormones means they dissolve readily in water, or proteins, or short polypeptides, or even amino acids can serve as hormones under certain circumstances. Now, lipid-soluble hormones are predominantly the sex hormones, the steroids. They're made from cholesterol.
Hormones act as chemical signals, but how do they trigger changes in particular target cells? Non-steroid hormones, hormones derived from amino acids, oxytocin and epinephrine for example, work via signal transduction pathways to activate or inhibit proteins within cells. These hormones can trigger an immediate response in target cells by turning cell components on or off. A non-steroid hormone binds to a receptor protein in the plasma membrane. The receptor activates a signal transduction pathway in the cell. A series of relay molecules transmits the signal to a protein that carries out the cell's response. In this case, an enzyme is activated. A different non-steroid hormone might trigger a different response, perhaps turning on specific genes that result in the synthesis of a particular protein.
Alright, water-soluble hormones cannot pass directly through the hydrophobic barrier of the plasma membrane, but they can bring about changes by binding to receptors. They bring about changes to that cell without entering that cell. Here we have let's say a protein molecule is the hormone. It binds to the receptor in the plasma membrane. We're at the target cell here. Alright, once the receptor binds, the hormone binds to the receptor, it initiates this pathway where these relay molecules carry the signal from here to here. And that causes a response in the cell. Now this molecule can either stay in the cytoplasm or enter the nucleus to initiate turn on a set of genes. Now lipid-soluble hormones, such as the sex hormones for example, which are steroid hormones, can pass directly through the barrier and bind to receptors inside the cell.
Steroid hormones such as testosterone or an estrogen acts by entering a target cell and turning genes on or off. Steroids usually act rather slowly because it takes time for the gene products to build up or become depleted. This steroid hormone passes through the plasma membrane and binds to a receptor protein in the cytoplasm. The hormone receptor complex enters the nucleus and attaches to specific regulatory sites on the target cell's DNA. There it acts as a transcription factor, a gene activator. A messenger RNA molecule is transcribed, which is then translated into a protein, an enzyme for example. This new protein alters the function of the target cell.
Alright, in this case, the testosterone molecule, the steroid hormone, passes directly through the plasma membrane. It binds to a receptor protein. Then the hormone receptor complex enter the nucleus and bind to a specific spot on the DNA molecule, thus turning on the gene. Alright, in this sequence we see that the hormone receptor complex is bound to the gene, which initiates the transcription of a messenger RNA segment, which directs the synthesis of a protein product. All right. In the natural course of things, we are exposed to chemicals that disrupt our endocrine system. There are different chemicals, weed killers, preservatives. And what these endocrine disruptors do, they mimic a specific lipids, in this case, estrogen. Now, what scientists have done is carry out studies to see if chemicals cause special effects like endocrine disruptors. Such a thing was done to male frogs, in which they exposed male frogs to low levels of atrazine, an ingredient found in most weed killers. So they had a control group and an experimental group. And then what they did was a mating contest in which the controls and the males exposed to atrazine competed for females. And they recorded each male frog's ability to grab the female, like so. And apparently, the frogs exposed to atrazine had less mating success, whereas with the control there was more success. Apparently the atrazine, there's a correlation here between exposure to atrazine and successful mating. And what the scientists observed was reduced desire for mating, less male hormone production, and in amphibians, sex can be reversed. In other words, males reverse to females. So the question is, what would that do to humans? Anyway, let's take a closer look at the vertebrate endocrine system with special emphasis on the human endocrine system. All right. Endocrine glands, such as the thyroid gland, secrete their products, hormones, by diffusion into the blood. Endocrine glands are ductless. In other words, they don't have ducts. And I also mentioned earlier, some glands that are part of the endocrine system also serve as part of other biological systems. For example, the pancreas has both an endocrine and non-endocrine functions. The pancreas is also considered part of the digestive system. Now, organs such as the stomach and the heart also have secretory cells that secrete chemical regulated hormones. And the kidneys too, although the kidneys are predominantly part of the urinary tract. Alright, in this diagram, these are the major endocrine organs, their locations in the body, and the compounds that they secrete. The pineal gland and the hypothalamus are in the brain. The hypothalamus is actually, the pituitary gland is thought to be the master gland of the endocrine system, but the pituitary only responds to under direction to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus produces the chemicals that control the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland can actually be thought of two glands, the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. Both have separate functions. Adrenal glands are found on top of the kidneys. The adrenal consists of an internal medulla and an outer cortex. The pancreas, its endocrines regulates blood sugar. Testes and ovaries. These are sex organs, but they're also part of the endocrine system too. the thyroid gland right underneath your larynx, and the parathyroid glands. Now, question is, what stimulates an endocrine gland to produce a hormone? Well, changes in blood levels in certain ions of nutrients, or stimulation by the nervous system. And hormones produced in one part of the endocrine system can affect other endocrine glands to release hormones as well. So, the endocrine system produces hormones that regulate water balance, ions, salt balance in the blood levels, and also speed up and slowing down metabolism. Hormones regulate the menstrual cycle, reproductive system, growth, development. I mean, that's a long list of what hormones do for us. And yes, hormoral release initiates a response to stress and other environmental factors. Alright, the pineal gland, a very tiny structure found in the brain. It synthesizes a compound called melatonin. This hormone regulates your sleep-wake cycles. The main control center at the endocrine system is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus receives input, telling it all about different things going on with the body. So it knows what environmental conditions are in different parts of the body. When the hypothalamus receives those signals, it sends out responses, either by way of the nervous system or by way of the endocrine system. The pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus, and the pituitary is directly regulated by the hypothalamus. The pituitary is located at the base of the brain, above the roof of your mouth. Literally, the roof of your mouth would be here. Alright, pituitary has two parts, the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. And each lobe has different functions. The posterior pituitary, inside the posterior pituitary is a set of neural secretory cells. These are neurons that secrete hormones, which are actually extended from the hypothalamus. Now, these neural secretory cells secrete oxytocin and ADH, antidiuretic hormone. These hormones are produced by the cells, but they are stored in the posterior pituitary until they need to be released.
If you find out they're coming today.
So here, posterior pituitary. So these neural secretory cells secrete their products to the posterior pituitary, which upon stimulation will diffuse into the blood system. Oxytocin, which stimulates uterine contractions during labor and tells the mammary glands to release milk. And antidiuretic hormone, which affects the kidney tubules, in other words, which promote the loss of water, antidiuretic. The anterior pituitary also contains similar neural secretory cells from the hypothalamus. Now, these secretory cells secrete two kinds of hormones. The releasing hormones, which stimulate the anterior pituitary to secrete either one or more specific hormones, and inhibiting hormones, which tell the anterior pituitary to stop secreting specific hormones. So basically the pituitary hormones, TSH, which works on the thyroid, ACTH, which works on the adrenal cortex, FSH and LH, follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone works on the gonads, prolactin works on mammary glands in mammals, and growth hormone, which works over the whole body. These hormones are protein hormones. Thyroid stimulating hormone regulates the production of T3 and T4 by the thyroid gland. ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex, which in turn releases hormones that affect water balance and metabolism. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone stimulates the testes and ovaries to produce their hormones. Prolactin stimulates mammary glands to produce milk. Growth hormone promotes protein synthesis and the use of body fat for energy metabolism. And an overabundance of growth hormone, yes, can lead to conditions such as gigantism or not enough, short. So, the hypothalamus and pituitary work together. There is a feedback control loop, a negative feedback loop. So, let's take a look at an example of this hormone cascade pathway. The hypothalamus secretes TRH, which tells the anterior pituitary to release TSH. TSH tells the thyroid to secrete thyroid hormone. Once the level of thyroid hormones is sufficient, it will cause inhibition of the hypothalamus to produce TRH, and which in turn inhibits the anterior pituitary from producing TSH. The thyroid gland is a very important part of regulating overall metabolism. Thyroid gland is just a very small gland. It's right on the surface of your larynx, underneath your larynx, on your trachea. There are two hormones, thyroxine and triiodothyronate. They're similar in that they need iodine. Together, these two hormones regulate metabolism. Too much of these hormones speeds up your metabolism. Too little slows you down. So, thyroid imbalance, hyperthyroidism, is when you have too much T4, T3, which leads to high blood pressure. You lose a lot of weight, overheating, and produces a compound called Graves' disease, which results in the eyeballs bulging out. Hypothyroidism is the opposite. Not enough T3 and T4, lower blood pressure, being overweight, being tired, lethargic, always cold. Another condition is goiter. This happens when you don't get enough iodine. Without iodine, the thyroid gland cannot produce enough T4 and T3, so your thyroid grows larger. It enlarges. The sex glands, ovaries in the females, and in the males, the testes produce sex hormones, testosterone, estrogens. Also produce the sex cells, eggs and sperm. But in addition to that, steroid sex hormones affect growth and development and regulate reproductive cycles, which has an effect on behavior. The synthesis of these is regulated by the hypothalamus and pituitary. The hypothalamus produces a releasing hormone gonadotropic release hormone, which stimulates the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH, which work on the testes and ovaries. There are three categories of sex hormones produced by the testes and ovaries. Estrogens, which work on the female reproductive system. Progestins, such as progesterone, which works on maintaining during pregnancy. And the male hormone testosterone, which stimulates the development and maintenance of the male reproductive system. And yes, imbalance of sex hormones can complicate sexual development. One such example is androgen insensitivity syndrome. This is an X-linked characteristic, and what happens when testosterone enters target cells, it cannot bind to the nuclear receptors because there is none. It's defective, it won't bind it. So these individuals are phenotypically female. They give the appearance of being female, although genetically they're males, but physiologically they're female. Now, sex determination. For example, sexual behavior. Testosterone causes aggressive male behavior, and also development of secondary sex characteristics like manes and male lines. The pancreas has dual functions. As a digestive organ, it produces digestive enzymes by way of ducts into the small intestine. And its endocrine functions, it produces insulin and glucagon, which regulate blood sugar levels. Now, these two hormones are antagonists. They work opposite of each other. And their function is to keep the level of insulin keep blood glucose at a specific point. So we have two negative feedback systems. So let's say the set point for glucose is 90 milligrams per deciliter. After a meal, blood sugar goes up. As blood sugar rises above that set point, it stimulates the pancreas to release insulin. Insulin tells all the body cells to take up glucose. Liver and muscle cells will convert glucose into glycogen, which is a storage form for glucose. Then as the blood sugar decreases, insulin secretion shut off as the blood sugar returns back to that 90 milligrams per deciliter. Now, after some time, blood sugar drops below that set point, and this stimulates the release of glucagon. Glucagon tells the cells to release sugar. It stimulates the breakdown of glycogen into glucose in liver cells and muscle cells, which raises the blood sugar back to the set point. An imbalance of blood maintenance of appropriate blood sugar levels is diabetes mellitus, which also better known as hyperglycemia. The body cannot either not produce enough insulin or respond to insulin. So what this means is we have a decrease in absorption of glucose by body cells, which results in a raising of blood sugar levels. Normally, muscle and fat cells respond to insulin by soaking up glucose. And this is done by when insulin binds to the insulin receptors of these cells. Now, normally when blood sugar is high, glucose is taken up. But so normally vesicles containing the glucose bind to the cell and trigger endocytosis or facilitated diffusion through a receptor. In type 1 diabetes, no insulin is produced. Lack of insulin. So the receptors are fine. The cells have normal receptors, but no insulin to bind to them. In type 2, the cells do not respond to insulin. The insulin is there, but the cells don't respond to insulin. So type 1 is insulin dependent. This is an autoimmune disease. For whatever reason, the body has destroyed the beta cells which produce insulin. This type of diabetes is treated with insulin injections. Type 2 is the cells do not respond to insulin. This is associated with being overweight and inactive. Most diabetes is type 2. Gestational diabetes is only during pregnancy and typically goes away after birth. And in this diagram we see a comparison of blood glucose levels. Normal in blue, diabetic in red. The endocrine system includes also the 2 adrenal glands, one on top of each kidney. They're actually a pair of glands fused together. The central part's called the medulla, the outer part's the cortex, and they secrete hormones in response to stress. The hypothalamus stimulates the medulla, adrenal medulla, to secrete adrenaline, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. These 2 hormones trigger the fight or flight response, which is short-term response to stress. So, in other words, what happens, the adrenaline or noradrenaline increase the breakdown of glycogen and glucose, raise your blood pressure, you start taking in more air, your metabolism speeds up. Blood flow, less blood flow to the urinary and digestive tract, more to your muscles, skeletal muscles. So when we're under stress, nerve signals in the hypothalamus send an impulse by way via the spinal cord and spinal nerves and trigger the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine and norepinephrine, which increases blood sugar levels, increases your blood pressure, breathing rate, metabolic rate, and blood flow patterns. In other words, less blood goes to the digestive and kidneys, but more to the skeletal muscles. So you're ready to fight. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, stimulates the long-term response to stress, stimulates the adrenal cortex to secrete corticosteroids. Glucocorticoids reinforce the effects of glucagon, in other words, raising blood sugar levels, and mineralocorticoids act mainly on salt-water balance, and which in turn maintain homeostasis. So mineralocorticoids promote the retention of sodium in water, by the kidneys, which results in increased blood volume and blood pressure. Glucocorticoids stimulate the breakdown of proteins and fats, the conversion to glucose, which leads to increased blood glucose. At the same time, that suppresses the immune system. That's why you get sick more easily when you're under stress, because of that. That's why long-term stress is not healthy. The hormone prolactin is produced and secreted by the anterior pituitary. It stimulates the growth of mammary glands and production of milk. And when a newborn suckles, it stimulates further release. And a consequence of that, high PRL levels inhibit ovulation. In other vertebrates and other animals, PRL does different things in non-human mammals, and non-human nest building, in birds, fat metabolism, amphibians, and fish. So this seems to be a hormone that evolved and has been a part, and even in the human-dog relationship, hormones apparently play a part. Oxytocin, which stimulates uterine contractions and the ejection of milk, also promotes mating and maternal bonds. But it's been shown that the hormones level rise when human mothers look at their babies for the first time, and when dog owners are looked at by their puppy dogs.